The morning fog rolled across the Thames as Chen Wei stepped out of the small apartment he called home in East London. At first glance, nobody would think twice about this 42-year-old man walking down the street. He was average height, maybe 5 feet 7 inches, with graying hair that he kept neatly combed. His clothes were simple: a plain blue jacket, dark pants, and comfortable walking shoes that had seen better days. But looks can be deceiving, very deceiving. Chen carried himself with a quiet confidence that most people missed. His shoulders were relaxed, his breathing steady, and his eyes constantly aware of everything around him. When he walked, his feet barely made a sound on the pavement. These weren't things he thought about anymore. They were just part of who he was after spending 15 years in the mountains of rural China. Those mountains had been his home, his school, and his testing ground. Every morning before sunrise, Chen would wake up and begin his training. Not the kind of martial arts you see in movies with flying kicks and dramatic poses. This was different. This was real. His master, an old man named Wu who lived in a small temple, had taught him the ancient ways that most people had forgotten or never learned at all. Chen learned how the human body worked, not just the muscles and bones that everyone could see, but the hidden pathways of energy and blood that flowed beneath the skin. He studied pressure points like other people studied books. Each point on the human body had a purpose, a function, a way to help or harm depending on how it was touched. Some points could ease pain and bring healing. Others could stop an attacker without causing permanent damage. And some were dangerous enough that Chen hoped he would never need to use them. The training was brutal. Not because Master Wu was cruel, but because the knowledge was too important to learn halfway. Chen would practice the same movement thousands of times until his muscles remembered it even when his mind was asleep. He learned to strike with the precision of a surgeon and the speed of lightning. But the physical training was only part of it. Master Wu taught him that true strength came from knowing when not to fight. A master who seeks battles is no master at all, the old man would say. The greatest victory is the one that happens without a single blow being thrown. Chen took those words to heart. In all his years of training, he had only used his skills in real combat 3 times. Each time, it was to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. Each time, he had tried every other option first. When Master Wu passed away, Chen knew his time in the mountains was over. The old man had taught him everything he could. Now it was time to take that knowledge into the world and find a way to use it for good. That's how he ended up in London working as a security consultant. His reputation in certain circles was impressive, though he never talked about it himself. Companies that dealt with high-risk situations would quietly call Chen when they needed someone who could handle problems that regular security couldn't solve. He had worked for tech companies protecting their executives from industrial spies. He had helped museums secure priceless artifacts from sophisticated thieves. He had even spent 6 months protecting a family whose father had testified against some very dangerous people. But his current job was different. More prestigious, but also more complicated. The Royal Palace Security Exchange program was designed to bring international experts to London to share knowledge and improve protection methods. Chen had been selected because of his unique background, a man who understood both ancient wisdom and modern threats. On his first day at the palace, Chen was amazed by the history surrounding him. The building had stood for centuries, protecting kings and queens through wars, revolutions, and changing times. The weight of that responsibility wasn't lost on him. The other security personnel were impressive in their own ways. Most of them were former military, with years of experience in dangerous situations around the world. They knew about weapons, tactics, and modern security technology. They were professionals who took their job of protecting the royal family very seriously. But they didn't understand Chen. How could they? His methods seemed strange, outdated, maybe even silly to people trained in conventional security. When Chen suggested that guards should learn to read body language more carefully, they politely listened but clearly thought it was a waste of time. When he mentioned that understanding pressure points could help them subdue threats without causing serious injury, they exchanged glances that said, "Here we go again." The worst part was that Chen couldn't easily demonstrate what he meant. His Techniques required trust and cooperation from the other person. You can't show someone how to apply a sleeper hold or pressure point technique on an unwilling participant. It's too dangerous. So Chen found himself in the frustrating position of being an expert who couldn't prove his expertise. He could talk about the theory, he could explain the anatomy, but he couldn't show the practical application without risking someone's safety. The other guards were polite enough during meetings and briefings. They would nod when he spoke and ask reasonable questions, but he could see the skepticism in their eyes. To them, he was just another consultant brought in to justify someone's budget, spouting theories about ancient martial arts that had no place in modern security work. The person who made this most clear was Sergeant Morrison. James Morrison was everything Chen was not. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that could be heard across a crowded room. He had served in the military for 12 years before joining the Royal Guard, and he had the kind of commanding presence that made people automatically stand straighter when he walked by. Morrison wasn't cruel or deliberately mean to Chen. He was just dismissive. The way someone might be dismissive of a child who claimed they could fly. Not angry, just completely unconvinced and slightly amused by the whole thing. During their first week working together, Morrison had made several comments that showed what he really thought. "That's interesting, Chen," he would say after one of Chen's suggestions in the tone of voice people use when they're being polite, but don't want to continue the conversation. Or worse, Morrison would sometimes ask questions that sounded genuine but were actually designed to show how impractical Chen's ideas were. "So you're saying that if someone comes at me with a knife, I should try to find a specific point on their wrist instead of just using my training to disarm them?" The question would be followed by a pause that let everyone think about how ridiculous that sounded. The other guards began to follow Morrison's lead. It wasn't that they disliked Chen personally. He was quiet, respectful, and clearly knowledgeable about security in general. But when it came to his martial arts background, they saw it as harmless but irrelevant, like a colleague who collected stamps or knew a lot about ancient history. Chen tried different approaches to gain their respect and understanding. He brought in books about pressure point therapy and showed them medical studies proving that certain techniques could affect blood flow and nerve response. The guards were polite but unimpressed. Medical theory was one thing, they said. Real-world application was something completely different. He offered to bring in video demonstrations or invite other experts to explain the science behind traditional martial arts. But Morrison would wave these suggestions away with comments like, "I'm sure it's very interesting, but we need to focus on practical training that we know works." The most frustrating part for Chen was that he agreed with them about focusing on practical training. Everything he wanted to teach them was practical. More practical in some ways than what they were already doing. But without being able to demonstrate it safely, he was stuck trying to explain colors to people who had never seen anything but black and white. Chen began to understand how scientists must have felt centuries ago when they tried to convince people that the Earth was round or that diseases were caused by tiny invisible creatures. The evidence was there, the logic was sound, but without a way to make it visible and obvious. It was just another wild theory. As the weeks passed, Chen settled into a routine of polite frustration. He would attend meetings, offer his insights, when asked, and quietly do his job of analyzing potential security weaknesses. He was good at that part. His years of training had taught him to notice things that others missed. But he could feel the opportunity slipping away. He had been brought to London to share knowledge and improve security methods. Instead, he was becoming just another consultant who filled out reports and attended meetings that nobody really wanted him to attend. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, surrounded by people whose job was to protect others, and they couldn't see that he was trying to give them better tools to do that job. It was like being a doctor with the cure for a disease, but having no way to prove that the medicine worked until someone was already sick. Chen had dealt with skepticism before. It came with the territory when you practiced something that most people didn't understand. But this was different because the stakes were so much higher. These weren't just martial arts students who might miss out on learning something interesting. These were people responsible for protecting some of the most important figures in the world. Still, Chen remained patient. Master Wu had taught him that patience was often. The security briefing room at the palace was nothing fancy, just a long wooden table surrounded by metal chairs, with a whiteboard on one wall and a few motivational posters that looked like they had been there since the 1990s. But this Tuesday morning, the tension in that ordinary room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Chen sat in his usual spot near the end of the table, a notepad in front of him and a pen that he rarely used. Around the table sat 12 other security personnel, all looking like they would rather be anywhere else. These weekly briefings were necessary but not exciting, mostly updates about schedule changes, new protocols, and reminders about procedures that everyone already knew by heart. Captain Rodriguez, a woman in her late 40s who ran these meetings, was going through the usual list of items. A state dinner next week that would require extra staffing, new metal detectors being installed at the east entrance, updated background check procedures for temporary staff. Chen half listened while studying the faces around the table. After weeks of working with these people, he had learned to read their moods and attitudes. Most of them were professional but bored. A few were genuinely engaged with the security updates. And then there was Morrison. Sergeant Morrison sat directly across from Chen, his large frame making the metal chair look small and uncomfortable. He was the kind of person who took up space not just physically but emotionally. When Morrison was in a good mood, the whole room felt lighter. When he was annoyed, everyone knew it. Today, Morrison looked annoyed. His jaw was set tight, and he kept checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. Chen had learned to recognize these signs over the past few weeks. When Morrison got restless during meetings, he usually found a way to stir up some kind of discussion or debate. Chen hoped today would be different, but hope and reality don't always match up. Captain Rodriguez had just finished talking about the new visitor screening procedures when she made a comment that would change everything. "We've been asked to consider incorporating some additional defensive training into our monthly skills workshops," she said, glancing down at her notes. "The idea is to expand beyond our current weapons and restraint training to include some alternative approaches." She looked up at Chen. "Chen, since you have extensive martial arts background, would you like to share some thoughts about what that might look like?" Chen felt every eye in the room turn toward him. He had been hoping for an opportunity like this for weeks, but now that it was here, he found himself being very careful with his words. These men and women were trained professionals who deserved respect, not lectures about things they might not understand. "Well," Chen began slowly, "I think there could be value in teaching some basic pressure point techniques, not as a replacement for existing training, but as an additional tool. Sometimes in security work, you need to subdue someone quickly without causing serious injury. Traditional pressure points can be very effective for that." He paused, looking around the table. Most faces were neutral, waiting to hear more. Morrison's expression had shifted from bored to skeptical. "The advantage," Chen continued, "is that these techniques work regardless of size difference. A smaller person can effectively use them against someone much larger, and they can be applied in situations where weapons aren't appropriate or available." Captain Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Can you give us a specific example of how that might work?" Chen had prepared for this question, but he still felt nervous about his answer. "There are points on the neck and shoulder area that, when pressed correctly, can temporarily disrupt someone's balance and coordination. It's not permanent and it doesn't cause real harm, but it can give you the few seconds you need to gain control of a situation." That's when Morrison spoke up. His voice was loud enough that everyone in the room could hear the skepticism clearly. "Pressure points," he said, shaking his head with a slight smile. "You mean like in those old kung fu movies? Touch someone in the right spot and they just fall over?" A few other guards chuckled quietly. Chen felt his face grow warm, but he kept his voice calm. "It's not like the movies, but yes, there are specific anatomical points that can affect nerve response and blood flow when pressure is applied correctly." Morrison leaned back in his chair, his smile growing wider. "Right. And I suppose you learned all this from some ancient master living on a mountain somewhere?" The chuckles around the table got a little louder. Chen realized that Morrison was enjoying this. turning Chen's genuine offer to help into entertainment for the rest of the team. Actually, yes, Chen said quietly. I did learn from a master who lived in the mountains, but the techniques aren't magic or mystical. They're based on anatomy and physiology, the same principles that doctors and physical therapists use. Morrison made a show of looking impressed. Wow, so you're telling us that doctors have been hiding these secret pressure point techniques from the rest of us? That seems like something that would be pretty well known if it actually worked. Chen felt the conversation slipping away from him. He had hoped to have a serious discussion about practical techniques that could help these people do their jobs better. Instead, Morrison was treating it like a comedy show. The techniques are known, Chen said, trying to keep his voice steady. They're used in martial arts, in certain medical treatments, and in some law enforcement training. They're just not widely taught in traditional security programs. Uh-huh. Morrison nodded like he was humoring a child. And how exactly would we test whether these mysterious pressure points actually work? Are you going to volunteer to let us practice on you? That got a bigger laugh from around the table. Even Captain Rodriguez was smiling, though she looked like she was trying not to encourage Morrison too much. Chen took a deep breath. This was exactly the problem he had been facing for weeks. How do you prove that something works when demonstrating it properly requires a level of trust and cooperation that nobody is willing to give? Obviously, any training would need to be done very carefully, Chen said. These techniques can be dangerous if applied incorrectly, but there are ways to practice them safely with proper supervision, and Morrison cut him off with a wave of his hand. Oh, come on, Chen. Listen to yourself. These techniques are so dangerous that we can't even practice them safely, but somehow, they're going to be useful in real-world situations where people are actually trying to hurt us? The room had gone quiet except for Morrison's voice, which was getting louder and more confident. Chen could see that the other guards were starting to enjoy the show. It was probably the most entertaining briefing they'd had in months. You can't have it both ways, Morrison continued. Either these pressure points are harmless party tricks that don't actually work, or they're dangerous weapons that are too risky to train with. Which is it? Chen felt trapped. Everything Morrison was saying sounded logical on the surface, but it completely missed the point. It was like saying that surgery was either harmless or too dangerous to learn, ignoring the fact that surgeons spend years training to use dangerous tools safely and effectively. The techniques require training and precision, Chen tried to explain. Just like any other professional skill, a doctor can perform surgery safely because they've trained for years to do it correctly. The same principle applies here. Morrison laughed out loud at that. Did he just compare touching people's necks to performing surgery? That's perfect. He looked around the table, making sure everyone was paying attention to his performance. Tell you what, Chen, Morrison said, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. Why don't you show us one of your pressure point moves? Just a little demonstration. Nothing dangerous, of course. Maybe you could make me fall asleep by touching my wrist like they do in those martial arts movies. The room erupted in laughter. Even guards who had been trying to stay neutral were grinning at Morrison's suggestion. Chen felt his face burning with embarrassment. But more than that, he felt frustrated. These people were making fun of knowledge that could literally save their lives someday. I don't think a demonstration would be appropriate in this setting, Chen said quietly. Of course you don't, Morrison shot back. Because it doesn't actually work, does it? It's all just ancient wisdom and mystical energy and other things that sound impressive but don't mean anything in the real world. Morrison stood up from his chair, his 6'3" frame towering over everyone else in the room. You know what? I think you've been watching too many movies, my friend. All this talk about pressure points and ancient masters, it sounds like something out of a bad action film. He started walking around the table toward Chen, still talking to the room like he was giving a performance. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure Chen here is a nice guy, and maybe he knows some interesting history about martial arts or whatever. But we're not ancient warriors, people. We're modern security professionals dealing with real threats in the real world. Morrison stopped right behind Chen's chair, placing both hands on Chen's shoulders in what might have looked like a friendly gesture to someone who didn't understand body language. But Chen felt the weight and pressure in those hands. This wasn't friendship. This was dominance. The silence in the briefing room was different now. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of people listening to a presentation or the respectful pause during a serious discussion. This was the heavy, uncomfortable silence that comes right before something important happens, the kind that makes everyone hold their breath without knowing why. Chen remained perfectly still in his chair, while Morrison continued his performance behind him. The sergeant's hands were still resting on Chen's shoulders, and Chen could feel the man's confidence growing with every second that passed without resistance. "You see what I mean?" Morrison said to the room, giving Chen's shoulders a little squeeze that was supposed to look friendly but felt anything but. This is what happens when you live in a fantasy world of ancient masters and secret techniques. When reality shows up, suddenly all that mystical training doesn't seem so useful anymore. A few guards shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The joke had stopped being funny several minutes ago, but Morrison didn't seem to notice. He was too caught up in proving his point to realize that he was making everyone else in the room uncomfortable. Chen closed his eyes for just a moment and let his breathing settle. Master Wu's voice echoed in his memory. "The wise warrior does not seek battle, but when battle seeks him, he does not run away. Sometimes the only way to teach respect is to show strength." When Chen opened his eyes, he spoke in the same quiet voice he had been using throughout the meeting. "Sergeant Morrison, I would appreciate it if you would remove your hands from my shoulders." Morrison's grip tightened instead of loosening. "Oh, now you're giving me orders? That's interesting. A few minutes ago you were too scared to even demonstrate your amazing pressure point techniques. Now suddenly you want to tell me what to do?" The room was watching this unfold like a slow-motion car accident. Horrible to witness but impossible to look away from. Captain Rodriguez looked like she wanted to intervene, but she seemed unsure about how to handle the situation without making it worse. "I'm not giving orders," Chen said calmly. "I'm making a polite request. Please remove your hands." Morrison leaned down closer to Chen's ear, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "And what happens if I don't? Are you going to use your mystical pressure points on me? Are you going to call on your ancient master's spirit to help you out?" Chen felt something shift inside himself. Not anger, exactly. Master Wu had trained that out of him years ago. But something deeper and more focused. The part of him that had spent 15 years learning to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. "Last warning, Sergeant," Chen said quietly. "Remove your hands." Morrison laughed out loud and actually increased the pressure on Chen's shoulders. "Or what? You'll tell on me? You'll file a complaint? Face it, Chen. All your ancient wisdom doesn't mean anything when you're dealing with someone who actually knows how to handle himself." That's when Morrison made his biggest mistake. Instead of just keeping his hands on Chen's shoulders, he decided to make his dominance even more clear. He slid his right hand up to the back of Chen's neck and gave it a squeeze that was definitely not friendly. "Maybe it's time someone taught you how things work in the real world," Morrison said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "All this mystical martial arts nonsense might impress people back in whatever mountain village you came from. But here in London, we deal with facts. And the fact is that you're all talk and no." He never got to finish that sentence. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but to everyone watching, it seemed to unfold in slow motion. Chen moved so smoothly and quietly that at first, nobody was even sure he had moved at all. His left hand came up in what looked like a gentle, almost casual gesture, like someone reaching up to brush a piece of lint off their shoulder. But Chen's fingers found a very specific spot just below Morrison's left temple, right where the temporal artery passed close to the surface of the skin. This wasn't the dramatic, forceful strike that people expected from martial arts movies. It looked more like a doctor checking someone's pulse, or a friend giving a gentle pat. Chen's fingers pressed against that spot with precisely calibrated force, enough pressure to compress the artery and temporarily disrupt blood flow to specific areas of Morrison's brain, but not enough to cause any permanent damage. The entire contact lasted less than half a second. To most people in the room, it looked like Chen had simply reached up and touched Morrison's face. There was no dramatic impact, no loud sound, no visible sign that anything significant had happened. It was so subtle that several guards later said they weren't even sure they had seen Chen move at all. Morrison didn't react immediately. For about 2 seconds, he just stood there with his hand still on Chen's neck, looking confused. His brain was trying to process what had just happened, but the precise pressure Chen had applied was already starting to affect his nervous system. Did you just? Morrison started to say, but the words came out wrong. His tongue felt thick and uncooperative, like he had just woken up from a deep sleep. Chen stood up calmly and turned to face Morrison, gently removing the sergeant's hand from his neck. Morrison tried to step backward, but his left leg suddenly felt strange, not painful, just unsteady and unreliable. I used a technique called temporal artery compression, Chen said in the same quiet voice he had been using all along. I applied precise pressure to disrupt blood flow to the area of your brain that controls balance and motor coordination. The effects are temporary and completely harmless. Morrison's eyes went wide as he realized that his body wasn't responding normally. His left leg was shaking now, and when he tried to take another step backward, he nearly lost his balance entirely. What did you? Morrison tried to speak, but the words were getting more slurred with each passing second. His nervous system was reacting exactly the way Chen had known it would. The carefully applied pressure had temporarily scrambled the signals between Morrison's brain and his muscles. The technique affects the vestibular system, Chen explained, to the room, his voice as calm and educational as if he were teaching a college class. That's the part of your brain that controls balance and spatial orientation. Sergeant Morrison's coordination will be impaired for about 15 to 20 minutes, but he'll recover completely with no lasting effects. Morrison tried to take another step and his knees buckled. He grabbed for the table to steady himself, but his depth perception was affected too, and he misjudged the distance. His hand hit the edge of the table awkwardly, sending paper scattering to the floor. This is impossible, Morrison mumbled, his words badly slurred now. You barely touched me. How can this be happening? Chen moved closer, ready to catch Morrison if he fell completely. The human body has many vulnerable points that most people don't know about. Pressure applied to the temporal artery in exactly the right way can temporarily affect brain function. It's not magic or mystical energy. It's anatomy and physiology, just like I tried to explain earlier. Morrison's left leg gave out entirely and he dropped to one knee. He wasn't unconscious, his eyes were open and alert, but his motor control was completely scrambled. He tried to push himself back up too, standing, but his muscles wouldn't cooperate. I need to sit down, Morrison said, the words barely understandable through his slurred speech. Chen immediately helped him to a chair, supporting his weight and making sure he didn't fall. The effects will pass soon, Chen assured him. Your brain is just dealing with temporarily reduced blood flow to certain areas. It's like when your foot falls asleep, except it's affecting your balance center instead. The entire room was staring in shocked silence. These were security professionals who had seen combat, handled dangerous situations, and dealt with every kind of threat imaginable, but none of them had ever seen anything like this. Morrison slumped in the chair, his head lolling slightly to one side. He was trying to speak, but only managing to make confused, mumbling sounds. His eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Captain, Rodriguez found her voice first. Should we call medical? She asked, standing up from her chair. That won't be necessary, Chen said, kneeling down next to Morrison to check his pulse and breathing. His vital signs are normal. The disorientation will fade gradually over the next few minutes and he'll be completely back to normal within 20 minutes. Chen looked up at the other guards who were all staring at him like he had just performed magic. This is what I was trying to explain about pressure point techniques. They're not mystical or supernatural. They're based on detailed knowledge of human anatomy and the precise application of pressure to specific points. One of the younger guards raised his hand tentatively. But how did you know exactly where to press? I mean, you didn't even look. You just reached up and touched his temple. Chen nodded. After 15 years of training, you learn to identify anatomical landmarks by touch. Every person's body is slightly different, but the major pressure points are in roughly the same locations. When Sergeant Morrison put his hand on my neck, I could feel the angle of his head and estimate where his temporal artery would be. Morrison made a frustrated groaning sound and tried again to stand up. Chen gently pressed him back into the chair. Please don't try to move yet. Your inner ear is still trying to recalibrate. The silence in the briefing room stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. 12 security professionals sat frozen in their chairs, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Morrison remained slumped in, his chair, his coordination slowly returning but his pride clearly shattered. Chen stood calmly beside Morrison's chair, occasionally checking the sergeant's pulse and monitoring his recovery. To anyone watching, Chen looked completely relaxed, like he had just demonstrated how to operate a piece of office equipment rather than temporarily disabling a man twice his size with what appeared to be a gentle touch. Captain Rodriguez was the first to break the silence. Chen, she said slowly, I think we need to understand exactly what just happened here. Chen nodded respectfully toward his commanding officer. Of course, Captain. What would you like to know? Let's start with the basics. Is Sergeant Morrison in any danger right now? Chen knelt down next to Morrison again and gently lifted one of the sergeant's eyelids to check his pupil response. Morrison was alert and tracking normally, though his coordination was still impaired. No danger at all, Chen said confidently. His pulse is steady, his breathing is normal, and his pupils are responding properly to light. The technique I use temporarily reduces blood flow to a specific part of the brain, the area that controls balance and motor coordination. It's like applying pressure to a garden hose. When you release the pressure, everything flows normally. Again. Guard Peterson, a former Navy man in his 30s, raised his hand like he was back in school. But how is that even possible? I mean, you barely touched him. How can touching someone's temple make them lose their balance? Chen appreciated the genuine curiosity in Peterson's voice. This was the kind of question he had been hoping to answer for weeks. The temporal artery runs very close to the surface of the skin right here, Chen said, pointing to the spot on his own temple. It's one of the main blood vessels that supplies the brain. If you apply pressure in exactly the right place with exactly the right amount of force, you can temporarily reduce blood flow to the vestibular system. He gestured toward Morrison, who was trying to follow the conversation but still looked dazed. The vestibular system is what tells your brain which way is up and how your body is positioned in space. When it doesn't get enough blood for a few seconds, the signals get confused. That's why Sergeant Morrison felt dizzy and couldn't control his movements properly. Guard Williams, a woman who had served as a military medic before joining Palace Security, leaned forward with interest. That actually makes sense from a medical standpoint. But how do you know exactly how much pressure to apply? Too little and nothing happens. Too much, and you could cause serious damage. Chen smiled. This was exactly the kind of intelligent question that showed these people were starting to understand the science behind what they had witnessed. That's what takes years of training, he explained. You have to learn anatomy first, where every blood vessel and nerve pathway is located. Then you practice applying different amounts of pressure until you can feel the difference between effective compression and dangerous compression. It's similar to how a massage therapist learns to work with muscle tension without causing injury. Morrison was starting to regain more of his coordination. He managed to sit up straighter in his chair and his speech was becoming clearer. The weird thing is, he said, still sounding slightly confused, I didn't feel any pain at all. It was just sudden confusion, like my brain forgot how to control my body. Chen nodded. That's exactly right. Pain is usually caused by tissue damage or inflammation. This technique doesn't damage anything. It just temporarily disrupts normal function. It's actually much safer than most traditional restraint methods, which often involve applying force to joints or causing pain to gain compliance. Captain, Rodriguez had been taking notes throughout this explanation. So this is something that could be taught to security personnel? Some techniques, yes, Chen said carefully. The specific pressure point I use today is too advanced and too risky for general training. But there are many other points that can be used to control situations safely. Points on the wrist that can cause someone to release their grip. Points on the shoulder that can make an arm temporarily weak. Points on the leg that can affect someone's ability to run. Guard Thompson, who had been quiet throughout the entire incident, finally spoke up. "Why didn't you teach us any of this before? I mean, if these techniques really work, why keep them secret?" Chen sighed. This was the question he had been dreading, because the answer made him sound like he was making excuses. "I tried to explain the concepts," he said, "but without being able to demonstrate them safely, it just sounded like theory. And honestly, these techniques require a level of trust between teacher and student that we hadn't developed yet." He gestured toward Morrison, who was now able to hold his head steady and focus his eyes properly. "What I did to Sergeant Morrison was completely safe because I've been training for 15 years, and I knew exactly what I was doing. But if someone tried to copy this technique without proper training, they could cause a stroke or brain damage." Morrison was recovering quickly now. His speech was almost back to normal, though he still looked shaken by the experience. "You mean you could have hurt me seriously?" "If I had applied the pressure wrong, yes," Chen admitted. "Too much force, or pressure in the wrong location, could have cut off blood flow completely instead of just reducing it. That's why these techniques aren't taught casually." The room fell quiet again as everyone absorbed this information. They were beginning to understand that what they had witnessed wasn't just an impressive party trick. It was the result of decades of careful study and practice. Guard Martinez, who had been one of the people laughing at Chen's suggestions earlier, looked embarrassed. "Man, I feel like an idiot. I thought you were talking about some kind of fantasy martial arts stuff. I had no idea there was real science behind it." Chen shook his head. "You're not an idiot. You reacted exactly the way most people do when they hear about pressure point techniques. It does sound impossible until you see it demonstrated." Morrison was able to stand up now, though he moved slowly and kept one hand on the table for balance. "I owe you a serious apology, Chen, and not just for making fun of your training. I physically intimidated you, and you had every right to respond with force, but instead of hurting me, you chose a technique that would stop me without causing any real damage." Chen looked Morrison in the eye. "You weren't trying to hurt me, Sergeant. You were trying to prove a point and establish dominance. I responded with exactly the level of force necessary to neutralize the threat while keeping everyone safe. That's what this training is really about, having options other than do nothing or cause serious harm." Captain Rodriguez had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. "Chen, would you be willing to put together a proper training proposal? Something that explains which techniques could be safely taught and which ones require advanced training?" "I would be honored to do that, Captain," Chen replied. Peterson raised his hand again. "Could you show us some of the safer techniques? I mean, obviously not on people, but maybe explain how they work?" Chen considered this request carefully. "I could demonstrate some of the basic pressure points using anatomical diagrams and explanations, and there are some techniques that can be practiced safely with proper supervision." Morrison, who was now standing without assistance though still looking a bit unsteady, cleared his throat. "I have to ask, how many people know how to do what you just did?" Chen thought about this question seriously. Worldwide, maybe a few hundred people who could apply that specific technique safely. The knowledge isn't exactly secret, but it's not widely taught outside of certain martial arts traditions. Most pressure point training focuses on healing and pain relief, not tactical applications. Williams, the former medic, looked fascinated. "So you're basically one of the few people in the world who can use these techniques for security and law enforcement purposes?" "One of the few in Western countries, yes," Chen confirmed. "In China, there are several schools that still teach traditional martial medicine and tactical applications together, but it's becoming rarer as people focus more on modern techniques." Morrison sat back down, but this time because he wanted to, not because he couldn't stand up. "Okay, I have to ask the obvious question. If these techniques are so effective, why aren't they taught in military or police training?" Chen had been asked this question many times over the years. Several reasons. First, they take a long time to learn properly. Military and police training focuses on techniques that can be taught quickly and applied by anyone. Second, there's liability concerns. If someone applies these techniques incorrectly, the consequences can be severe. Third, Most people in charge of training programs don't understand the science behind them, so they assume it's all mystical nonsense. He paused and looked around the room. And fourth, until you've seen them demonstrated, they really do sound too good to be true. I don't blame anyone for being skeptical. Captain Rodriguez checked her watch and realized they had been in the briefing room for almost 2 hours. 3 weeks had passed since the incident in the briefing room, and the atmosphere at the palace had completely transformed. What started as one man's desperate attempt to prove his worth had become the beginning of something much larger. A revolution in how the security team approached their training and their understanding of what was possible. Chen arrived at work that morning to find a line of guards waiting outside his small office. This had become a daily occurrence since Captain Rodriguez had officially approved his expanded training program. Every day brought new questions, new requests for demonstrations, and new challenges that pushed Chen to explain complex concepts in ways that practical security professionals could understand and apply. "Morning, Chen," called Peterson, who was first in line as usual. The former Navy man had become Chen's most dedicated student, spending his off hours studying anatomy books and practicing the basic pressure point techniques that Chen had deemed safe for general training. "Good morning, Peterson." "Still working on the wrist control technique." Peterson grinned and held up his hands, which showed small bruises on the pressure points he had been practicing on training dummies. "Getting better every day. Yesterday I managed to make Rodriguez drop her coffee cup just by pressing the point you showed us. She wasn't too happy about that." Chen laughed. The wrist technique was one of the safer pressure points he taught. It caused a temporary weakness in the grip without affecting any vital functions. It was perfect for situations where someone needed to be disarmed quickly without causing injury. "Just remember to be careful with the pressure," Chen warned. "Too much force and you can cause nerve damage that takes weeks to heal." Behind Peterson stood Williams, Thompson, and Martinez, 3 guards who had become the core of Chen's advanced training group. They had progressed beyond the basic techniques and were now learning more sophisticated applications that required precise timing and positioning. "Chen," Williams said, holding up a medical textbook, "I was reading about the nervous system last night, and I think I understand why the shoulder technique works the way it does. It's disrupting the signals from the brachial plexus, right?" Chen nodded approvingly. Williams had turned out to have a natural aptitude for understanding the medical side of pressure point applications. Her background as a military medic gave her the foundation to grasp concepts that other students struggled with. "Exactly right. The brachial plexus is the network of nerves that controls arm movement. Apply pressure to the right spot, and you can temporarily interrupt those signals. The arm becomes weak and uncoordinated, but there's no permanent damage." Thompson stepped forward with his own question. "I tried the leg technique on the training dummy yesterday, but I don't think I'm hitting the right spot. The dummy didn't react the way it's supposed to." Chen smiled. Thompson was a perfectionist who got frustrated when techniques didn't work exactly as demonstrated. "Show me your hand position," Chen said. Thompson demonstrated his technique, and Chen immediately saw the problem. "You're placing your thumb about 2 inches too high. The pressure point you want is right where the femoral nerve passes close to the surface. Here, let me show you on the anatomy chart." Chen had invested his own money in detailed anatomical charts and models that he used for training. Captain Rodriguez had promised to include them in the official training budget, but Chen hadn't wanted to wait for bureaucratic approval. The demand for proper instruction was too urgent. As Chen worked with his students that morning, he reflected on how much had changed since that dramatic Tuesday in the briefing room. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had been steady and remarkable. The first change had been in Morrison himself. The big sergeant had gone from being Chen's biggest skeptic to his most vocal supporter. Within days of their confrontation, Morrison was telling anyone who would listen about the effectiveness of pressure point techniques. He had even volunteered to be Chen's demonstration partner for training sessions, allowing Chen to show new students exactly where the pressure points were located and how they felt when properly activated. "I was completely wrong about this stuff," Morrison had told the entire security team during their next weekly briefing. "I thought it was all fantasy and mystical nonsense, but Chen showed me that it's actually more scientific and precise than most of the techniques we already use." Morrison's endorsement had carried enormous weight with the other guards. If someone as skeptical and practically minded as Morrison believed in Chen's methods, then maybe there really was something worth learning. The second change had been in the training requests. Within a week of the incident, Captain Rodriguez was fielding calls from other security agencies asking about Chen's techniques. Word had spread through the tight-knit community of professional security personnel that something interesting was happening at the palace. "We've had inquiries from the embassy security team, airport security, and even some private protection agencies," Rodriguez had told Chen. "Everyone wants to know about these pressure point techniques you've been teaching." This external interest had helped convince the palace administration that Chen's program was worth supporting officially. Instead of being a consultant whose ideas were politely ignored, Chen suddenly found himself with a real budget, official training time, and the authority to develop a comprehensive curriculum. The third change had been in Chen himself. For the first time since arriving in London, he felt like he was actually accomplishing what he had come to do. Master Wu had taught him that knowledge was only valuable when it was shared with people who could use it to help others. Now, finally, Chen was able to pass on techniques that could make a real difference in dangerous situations. But perhaps the most important change was in how the entire security team approached their work. They had begun to see their bodies and their training in a completely different way. Instead of relying solely on strength, weapons, and standard restraint techniques, they now had subtle and precise tools that could resolve situations without causing harm to anyone involved. "It's changed how I think about everything," Peterson had told Chen the previous week. "Before, if someone was causing trouble, I basically had two options: ask them to stop or use physical force to make them stop. Now I have this whole range of techniques that can control a situation without anyone getting hurt." Chen was particularly proud of how his students had embraced the philosophical aspects of the training, not just the physical techniques. Master Wu had always taught that true martial arts mastery was about wisdom and restraint, not just fighting skills. The most important pressure point, Chen often told his students, is the one between your ears. These techniques are tools, and like any tool, they're only as good as the judgment of the person using them. As the morning training session continued, Chen noticed that Morrison had arrived and was watching from the doorway. The sergeant often stopped by to observe the classes, both to continue his own learning and to offer support for Chen's program. "How's the new group coming along?" Morrison asked, stepping into the room. Chen glanced at his current students who were practicing basic wrist techniques on training dummies. "Very well. Peterson and Williams are ready to move on to intermediate techniques. Thompson is still. Perfectionism is fundamentals, but that's actually good. He won't develop bad habits." Morrison nodded. "Any word on the official certification program?" This was the latest development in Chen's expanding role at the palace. Captain Rodriguez had proposed creating an official certification program that would allow Chen to train security personnel from other agencies and organizations. The goal was to establish standardized pressure point training that could be implemented safely across the security industry. "The paperwork is still working its way through the system," Chen said. "But Captain Rodriguez thinks we'll have approval within the next month. Once that happens, we can start offering formal courses to outside agencies." Morrison grinned. From mystical mountain warrior to official government trainer in less than 2 months. Not bad. Chen laughed at Morrison's description. The sergeant had developed a habit of joking about his earlier misconceptions, but always in a way that showed how much his respect for Chen had grown. "Speaking of training," Morrison continued, "I had an interesting conversation with my brother yesterday. He's a police officer in Manchester, and he was telling me about a situation they had with a suspect who was high on drugs. The guy was incredibly strong and seemed immune to pain, so their usual restraint techniques weren't working." Chen nodded. This was exactly the kind of situation where pressure point techniques could be invaluable. When someone was under the influence of drugs that blocked pain or increased strength, traditional force often became ineffective or dangerous. "I told him about the techniques you've been teaching us," Morrison continued, "and he was fascinated. He wants to know if there's any way his department could get access to this training." Chen considered this request. Police work involved different challenges than palace security. But the basic principles were the same: the need to control dangerous situations while minimizing harm to everyone involved. That's definitely something we could explore once the certification program is established, Chen said.